I have a question to ask.
Okay, you can go ahead.
I caught my eyes on the meaning of slavery on Wikipedia and Encyclopedia a few days ago. And that reminds me of how our forefathers were being enslaved.
Yes.
My question is, why is there slavery in Africa, and what gives the white men the audacity to colonize Africa?
Don't get it wrong. Slavery existed for centuries before the first slaves came to America.
Really?
Yes. Old Egyptian, Greeks, and Romans owned the slaves. In Africa there were many kingdoms and slavery was legal. When Europeans came to Africa, slavery there already existed.
Okay, I am listening.
The first European slave traders were from Portugal. The little country of Portugal built the first European fort in Africa in 1481. It was called Fort Elmina. Soon, people from other countries found out about the slave trade.
I thought Spain was the first European slave traders, Ma.
No. Spain was one of the biggest slave trading nations. They needed African slaves to work on their plantations in South America and Caribbean.
But what brought the word slave?
People often became slaves for reasons rooted in local disputes and wars, or they became slaves as a demonstration of wealth and power on the part of a local ruler. However, enslavement at a local level could often lead to a chain reaction of sales from merchant to merchant, ending up at the coast where the final sale resulted in being dispatched across the ocean.
Really? War is what sense?
Yes, war. A large number of people began the journey into slavery as prisoners of war. The Baganda in East Africa, for example, often went to war with their neighbors and took Bunyoro and Basoga people as slaves.
Really?
Yes. For example, the conflict between the kingdoms of Ayo and Dahomey resulted in prisoners of war being taken as slaves on both sides and then sold onto the coast.
Okay, Ma. But you mentioned punishment too. How does it related to slavery?
Yes. Punishment. Some people were taken into slavery as a punishment. The crime might be witchcraft, theft, or adultery.
I heard slavery was being made due to debt discharge, tribute, kidnap, vulnerable and unwanted, born into slavery.
Yes, that is true.
How? Please, kindly explain it to me.
Yes, slavery were done based on debt discharge. Selling someone into slavery could be a way of discharging a debt.
And what of tribute?
Yes, it may be for tribute. For example, in the area of Senegal, in the 17th century, slaves were given to the king as part of a village's tribute to him, along with brandy, tobacco and cloth.
Really? And what about kidnapping?
Kidnap. A large number of people were quite simply kidnapped while going about their everyday tasks. Igbos were particularly wary of being kidnapped and always fortified their houses if they left their villages. But some, like Olodrequiano, were caught unawares. Elsewhere in West Africa savannah, horsemen would sweep down from the north to launch annual slave raids on agricultural people. Occasionally Europeans would kidnap people and turn them into slaves, although by doing this they ran the risk of annoying the chain of Africa middlemen which extended from the interior to the coast.
Thank you so much. Vulnerable and unwanted. Ampersand. Born into slavery?
Yes. Slavery was done vulnerably. Ampersand unwanted. In times of famine children might be sold. Orphans, widows and poor relations were equally vulnerable. In the area of born into slavery. Some slaves were born into slavery in Africa. Traders and captains of slave ships preferred these because they were less trouble, having never known anything but slavery.
Thank you so much. But we, Nigeria, are colonized by the British, England. I think we should have been colonized by either Portugal or Spain.
Yes. We were colonized by England. And England was one of the latest countries to start slave trade. Soon England became one of the biggest slave trading nations. They began to bring slaves to the Caribbean. They formed the Royal African Company in 1672. This allowed English colonies in America to easily buy slaves from English traders. At the beginning, only a few slaves came to English colonies. But when the big tobacco and rice plantations grew in the colonies in the South, the slave trade increased.
Were the slave being stolen or bought out of Africa? Did the white man or British really enslave us?
No.
But I think they did.
No. Since slavery existed before the white men came down to Africa and it was being transacted like business, I didn't blame them.
How? Why? Then who should we blame?
We should blame ourselves. Because our forefathers started slavery.
But the white men are selfish too.
Although many people think that most slaves were stolen or caught by slave traders, this is not the truth. Most slaves were bought by Europeans from other African people. Often, rival tribes sold into slavery members of other tribes they captured during wars. Most of the slaves came from the West Africa and spoke many different languages.
But can you tell me the exact number of slaves that were taken from Africa?
No one knows the exact number of slaves that were taken from Africa. Philip Curtin, in 1969, calculated that about 10 million slaves were taken from Africa.
Really? Was he there, or does he come to the conclusion?
No. But here's a researchers. Though, other researchers found that 2 out of 10 slaves died before they arrived to the South or North America.
Hope I am not asking much questions, Ma.
Oh, don't mind. I'm here to tutor you.
Okay, if the research is correct, ampersand. Philip Curtin was curated. How many slaves died before they made it to Americas?
Only God knows. But history had it that many of them lost their life on the way.
Really? But why?
The trip was horrible. Many people died of diseases and were thrown overboard. People were packed like animals and had to watch others die and suffer. They did not know where they were going, and many decided to fight or even kill themselves. The ships carried much more people than they were made for. The slaves were given very little food during the trip. But, few days before they reached America, they were given extra food so they would look better and earn more money at the slave auction.
Okay, so what was really the factor?
Number 1 is the length of the trip. More slaves died on long trips. Even a few days made difference. Some trips took 40 days and some up to 150.
150? That is almost 5 months on the ship.
Yes. And the second factor is waiting on the ships. Many times slaves that were caught had to wait for the traders to buy more slaves before they sailed to America. They had to live in chains on the ships.
Okay.
Also, waiting in African forts. Traders built forts and trading posts to keep slaves until ships came to take them. Many forts were filthy dark dungeons.
That sounds ridiculous.
Yes. Another causes is rebellions. Many slaves fought to free themselves. They rebelled on the ships. Most of the time they did not succeed.
Rebellions. Is that rebellions? Or fight for freedom?
Don't get it wrong. They bought them with their own money. They have no right to freedom.
But conformity is important.
Yes. But not in this case.
Okay.
Suicide also took place. Some slaves could not stand the conditions. They were also afraid that white people will eat them. They got this idea because they knew that many people were taken from Africa but no one ever returned. Also, many slaves thought it is better to be dead than to be a slave. Most suicides were done by jumping overboard and drowning.
Really?
Yes. Also, murder. Sometimes the ship crews and traders would beat, punish and kill slaves. They could get away with it because slaves were not thought of as people.
That is bad.
Also, disease. Conditions on the ships were terrible. There were rats and bugs everywhere. Drinking water and food were spoiled. Dead bodies lied next to living people. Diseases such as dysentery were common and many slaves died from them. Some ships even had outbreaks of smallpox.
This is really bad. It's terrible.
Yes, it's terrible. They faces many terrible things on the way. Also, trauma. Many slaves went crazy. They were separated from families, tied in chains, and held as slaves. Many could not stand it and they became mad.
But were those mad slaves useful when they got to Europe?
I think they would. Though, I wasn't there. But some of them will be okay.
That is bad.
Also, slaves lost their lives in packing. There were 2 ways to pack a slave ship. Tight packing meant that you will load as many slaves as possible. Often their bodies touched. Loose packing meant that slaves were given some room to turn around and not touch another person. Less slaves died on loose packed ships.
My goodness. What has the people done to Africans?
Point of corrections. What had Africans done to themselves? They sold themselves so cheap. The forefathers were being carried away with principalities and powers. And they abused every right of individual.
Really?
Even hundreds of thousands were killed during the way out. Escape. Often slaves wanted to escape. They tried to escape before and during the trip. This was very hard and most were killed.
You really melt my heart with these. I had different thought on these issues. Thank you so much, Ma.
You are welcome. We shall meet some other time. See you later.
Okay, bye-bye.